Have a seat on your porcelain throne. It's time to talk some shit on the Powell movement.
I'm your host, Mike Powell, and 1 week after being back from vacation, things get turned upside down in my world. See, I have this dog, Chief. He's a French bulldog, and he's cute as shit. Everyone loves this dog, and he knows it. So much so that I feel like he tolerates my family. He's like, I know that you know I'm cute, and you can pet me, and you can take care of me, but when we are out and about, I want to meet every stranger, and I'll pretend that I absolutely love them for a couple of minutes, and then I want to go on to the next person and get that same love. And you guys, you're insignificant to me while we're on the road. I'll pay attention to you a little bit when we're at home. I mean, Chief is great, but I also compare him to like a supermodel. He knows he's good looking and he uses that to his advantage. But when it comes to being a dog, it's not like he gets excited when we get home from a vacation or anything. Like my golden retriever growing up, if I got one step in the house, he was sprinting up and jumping on me. Chief, he doesn't do anything like that. He lays there and he waits for you to come to him. Anyways, Chief ate something that made him puke, and he puked for a couple days straight. And it was getting to the point where he really needed to see a vet. So my wife took the reins on this one and tries to get him in to see a doctor. But this pandemic has made all the vets so busy that the ERs won't take walk-ins. But she was able to find one. And it was the only one available in the Seattle area. And you know what? It turned out to be a nightmare. Now, I didn't make the 5 different trips to the vet, but my wife sent pictures and videos to me to try and paint the picture of what this horrible place was all about. From the dimly lit hallways to the argumentative doctors and staff, the place sounded like something out of a horror movie. This is a place where dogs with minor things go to die. But we had to go there. There was no other option. And to make a long story short, our dog had something blocking a path in his stomach and it needed to be removed. And from what I gather, this is a pretty standard and routine procedure for most vets. But our vet, it took them 4 days. And when we finally were able to get our dog out of there, and it was a challenge to get him out of there, it was with a used dirty neck cone that was covered in dirt. He also had gauze that looked like it was used as well. It was pretty nasty. And I bet we were charged for all of it. The good news is my wife was a trooper and she was able to get our dog home. And he seems pretty normal, other than the shave and the scar. And I'm hoping he's not going to need counseling for this one. And the scar, it won't matter. It's right next to the scar he has from us removing his balls. So it was a really scary and expensive couple of days for the Powell family. It was like doing Hawaii all over again, but all we get out of this one is our supermodel of a dog back, and that's all that matters. And all that should matter to you right now is my interview with Chris Engelsman. If you don't remember Chris, he's a legend in clickers. He was known for being really tall, for his switch riding. He started brands, he led media empires, and he always had some kind of hustle going on. It's a fun conversation, and before we talk to ETree, I want to ask you to follow me on Instagram at The Powell Movement and review me on iTunes. For the review, it's really easy to do, it means a lot to me, and the good ones really make me feel good about myself. And I need that. If I read your review at the end of the podcast in the review of the week, I'll send you a beanie. If that's not your thing, fine. Then please support my amazing sponsors who make this thing happen. They are the 10 Barrel Brewery, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports, Rollerblade, Stanley, and Alpine Vans. Now, let's talk to Chris Engelsman. It's perfect timing for me to have you on the show, as one of your longtime sponsors, Dragon, is a new sponsor to the show. Well, they start actually in a couple weeks, but when you were with them, I heard there was a photo shoot where you lost your goggles and you had to wear Morgan Lafont's Oakleys. And what's the whole story behind that?
Yeah, good research there. That was my first photo shoot with K2 and early on in my career. And it was pretty funny. It was like our very first jump we were hitting. And I just went off the jump and just lawn darted straight head first into the POW and came up, lost my goggles. And at that point in time, I was a full rookie with Dragon as well, and they'd only sent me one pair of goggles. And those goggles were gone. We could not find them anywhere, in just a massive powder field. So Morgan, she was legit and a pro, and she had her spare pair of goggles there and handed me a pair, which unfortunately were Oakleys. And out of that photo shoot ended up a nice 2-page spread ad of me in a pair of Oakley goggles. The funny thing is I had no idea that K2 was running that ad until I saw it in a magazine, which was about the same time that Dragon saw it. Oh. Actually, I'm sure Dragon saw it before me, because being an advertiser, they all get the magazines like right away.
Right.
Yeah, and I get this call from them, and they're just like, dude, what's up? And I'm just like, dude, I had no idea, but you guys only sent me one pair of goggles. I'm going to need a couple more pair than that. So, yeah, that was a little rocky road to start it off. But, yeah, I stayed with those guys my entire career. So I was super, super helpful, super stoked on those guys. And when I actually first got on the program, Will Howard, the founder, got me on board with Dragon, which was really cool. And then worked with all the different team managers over the years. So was with those guys when they were working out of a condo in San Juan Capistrano.
With that shoot too, I think another funny thing about it is like you're a big dude. You're like 6'2", and you're riding a 147 Fat Bob in that shoot. Something you would never ever ride. Did shit like that happen a lot during photo shoots? Like, hey, this is the only product we have, and you're gonna shoot with it regardless.
Well, the funny thing is back then people were riding short boards at that time.
They are now too, right?
Yeah, so everything goes in circles and, goes out of fashion, comes back in fashion. Granted, a board that small is definitely too small for a tall guy like me, but sometimes you do it. I mean, I rode a 145 for a while. It's fun, but, the size of jumps you're hitting on a 145 are not the same as if you're on a properly sized board. But for doing little spins and little things like that, small boards are super fun.
Yep. And I guess one thing that really separates you from a lot of snowboarders is that you come from a place that isn't known for pro snowboarders. I mean, when I think of dudes coming out of Michigan, it's like you and Danny Davis. Who else came out of Michigan that made it big?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, that's pretty much about it. I mean, a lot of guys came out, like in my era, there was Matt Miner. He moved out west to Colorado, and I crashed at his pad in Colorado. But then for some reason, most people end up back in Michigan. And for myself and Danny Davis, we stayed out west and stayed here. We loved it. So yeah, kind of strange that more people don't come out of the ranks out of Michigan, considering Michigan has the second largest number of ski resorts in the U.S.
Yeah, I did not know that because no one outside of Michigan goes to them because they go out west. But the one thing about Michigan is like you grew up 40 miles from the birthplace of snurfing, which is like the precursor to modern day snowboarding. Did you see a lot of snurfers growing up?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we had snurfers growing up, and we would tow them behind three-wheelers and try to surf and snowboard and stuff like that. It's pretty fortunate in that. And I actually grew up, like a mile down the road from my house was an abandoned ski area that went out of business probably like in the early 70s before really snowmaking was around, and they had a couple bad years and they shut down. So, but early on, it's like I saw like all kinds of snurfers, and then later on swing boos out of France were around and different things like that. So yeah, pretty fortunate.
I know Muskegon is kind of full of beaches, but were you a ski family? Did you start out skiing?
Yeah, we did. My mom, just as a little girl, I mean, she grew up in the area that I was raised, and, like her and her dad would go, and she never got to ski as a kid. She would go to that resort that ended up going out of business and just watch people skiing and stuff. And she really wanted to do that. So she was the driving factor in our family. And, I started skiing when I was 4. And then very early on, we saw snowboards, and, I was into skateboarding, and they were just like, oh, I bet you would love that, wouldn't you? The answer was yes.
And is this all like the Animal Chin days when you get into skateboarding?
Oh, yeah. And earlier than that even. But yeah, Animal Chin and those are just amazing.
Like what you grew up with, that's you're 12 years old, you're watching that shit.
Exactly.
How about team sports? Did you play any team sports growing up?
I did everything as a kid, football, basketball, baseball, track. I did that one year in like junior high, but I wasn't into that. I wanted to go skateboard, and then even baseball. I was just like, dude, spring is for skateboarding. And then the only sport I ended up playing all the way through high school was football, actually. And then basketball, I just quit. I was a starter on the basketball team, and I just quit after my like junior, I think maybe even after my sophomore year, just because I wanted to snowboard. I was like getting sick of getting yelled at coaches, and I was just like, dude, I'd rather go snowboard than get yelled at and lose.
And it's like the high school Chris. I mean, are you wearing snowboard t-shirts to school and just like a total skate snow kind of rat who happens to be a jock a little bit as well in the team sports realm?
So the funny thing is, I don't know what kind of shoes I had, but at the time I was doing ETree and I was doing clothing, and that's what would pay for me to travel to go to snowboard contests during the winter. I'd be able to pay for like lift tickets and gas money and different things like that to go to contests in Michigan.
In high school, you started that?
Yeah, I started that just by silkscreening t-shirts and making hats and packs and different things like that. And so, yeah, like in football, I probably had a pair of Nike cleats and stuff, but I took a black paint pen and marked out this swoosh and then wrote ETree on the side of my shoes. And so I was not your typical high school type athlete. I was like a long hair, and, I wouldn't go in and lift weights and do things like that because I was too busy skating.
And then in terms of how much you were able to ride, are you riding nights and weekends and going as much as you possibly can all through high school?
Yeah, I mean, we had a 3-inch rule growing up. So it's like if it snowed 3 inches, that was enough to cover the blades of grass. And we would go, but I was lucky enough, my good friend, his house, he had a hill on his yard. And so we would have them plow all the snow into one pile at the top. And then we would have a stockpile of snow that we could make a runway to a jump. And so it's all green grass on the side, but we had a runway to a jump to a landing well after snow was gone everywhere else. And then he had like a natural gully up at the top of his driveway, and we cut down some trees and made a 3-hit half pipe in this gully and stuff like that, and put up a snow fence at the bottom to capture snow. So we farmed it for sure. I mean, most of our days were just on our local hills back then. The closest ski area for me was 45 minutes away. So I was only there maybe once a week type thing, but we were still doing stuff on our local hills.
Was there an arm of like the USASA that had started up in the Midwest at that point?
Yeah, there was, just like all across the country, at that time there was the was it USA? Yeah, USASA, I'm guessing is what it was at that point. And, going around to those contests. And then I think, kind of like my first year doing all the contests, doing the series, I was able to go to nationals out in Stratton. So that was pretty cool.
So are you one of the dominant guys in the Midwest in that class?
I mean, in Michigan, yeah. So I was the kid from Michigan that went for, like our age group, all the different age groups at that time.
When do you start going to Hood? Because I feel like when doing my research, it seemed like it was around junior year-ish. It was like you were planning on going to the University of Colorado at Boulder and you had made that idea up early. But then you go to Mount Hood. And is that just a eye-opening experience that changes everything for you?
I wouldn't say changes. Yeah, it kind of did, just because I went to Hood probably the summer of 92. I was a junior or senior in high school. I don't know, something like that. But that was just like the amazing thing. I mean, back in the day, my good buddy went to a ski camp out at Hood, which just, illuminated, I was like, oh my gosh, you can do that. That's amazing. And so I worked my ass off to save up my money to go to camp and did that, and was just like in heaven. I mean, all these pros were there and all this stuff. I mean, even back then, I think it was year number 2 for Windell's.
What made you pick Windell's over High Cascade? Because it seems like people go one way or the other, and you went Windell's and you were friends with all the High Cascade people. I think you're always welcome at their parks and stuff. But what made you choose Windell's?
Cheaper. It's what I could afford. Honestly, that's the reason that got me over there to Windell's. Right off the bat, though, just built a relationship with Tim and just everyone that was there, like the coaches and stuff like that. And it was family. And then I just stayed there for the next decade.
Did your parents help you out with anything? Was there money in the Engelsman family where they could help you go to camp, or were they just like, you're going to do this all on your own?
No, I mean, my parents figured out very early on what motivated me, and that was either getting a new wetsuit or going to snowboard camp. So there was grades all associated with it. It's like if you get honor roll or all A's or different things like that, it's like, oh, we'll help you do this or we'll help fund that and different things like that. So that was a huge portion of what could get me going different places.
And then the rest you would save up for?
Yeah.
And it seems like you were always a little bit of a hustler, it sounds like you were an institution at camp for a long time. And you were the digger when you became a digger eventually, who always had the get-rich-quick idea, whether it was laundry balls or selling cars at auctions or selling hot dogs for the kids. Did you always have that idea of like needing to hustle and create something?
Well, laundry balls, that was a Sean Duarte idea.
Okay.
That he tried to rope me into. But anyway, Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like the hot dogs, the digger dogs was just like Tor Drake and myself. We went camping out at the coast one weekend and we bought a little hibachi, to grill up some hot dogs. And then we were like, well, dang, this would be awesome up on the hill, have a hot dog for lunch. And so then we brought that up and it just kind of evolved to where then it was like, a camper or two were like, oh, dude, I want a hot dog. I want one of those. And then we were just like, interesting. And then it just snowballed into a little side hustle that all us diggers were a part of.
Is that the precursor to Cobra Dogs?
I don't know, but it instituted Cobra Dogs, but, who knows? I mean, Cobra Dogs is awesome, though.
But you guys are making some money selling hot dogs on the hill?
Oh, yeah. It got us Dairy Queen every day, so that was awesome.
And camp was what changed your college plans, I feel like. You were planning on going to Boulder, and you were talked into Western State when you were at Hood. And do you just come home and tell your folks, like, hey, I'm not going to go to the University of Colorado anymore. I'm going to go to Western State. And then your parents look at you like you're going to Western where?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly. I went to Hood and met Brian Delaney and Kurt Hoy there and was telling them I was going to go to CU Boulder. And they were just like, oh, man, Boulder is way too far from the mountains. They're like, you're way too good. Go check out this school. They're like, it's just down the road from Crested Butte. So yeah, then I go home, I tell my parents, and my parents were like, well, you should probably check this place out before you go,
Right.
Which was maybe a bad idea on their behalf. So then, that next winter I went out and checked out Western State and Gunnison and got to snowboard, with the snowboard club and whatnot. And I was just like, oh my gosh, Crested Butte's insane. It's amazing. And I was sold. And yeah, a little shift in path, but it was great.
Coming from Michigan, Crested Butte has to be super intimidating, but terrain aside, how long does it take you to even figure out riding and landing in powder? Because I would think that's the big challenge.
Yeah. Well, and the crazy thing is my first year in Crested Butte was absolutely amazing for snowfall. In February, it snowed 20 out of 28 days. And I was actually just looking, I think like last winter at the snowfall charts, and that was actually the snowiest February on record.
Huh.
And it was the third snowiest winter on record. So my very first year riding Crested Butte was like one of the best, third best ever.
Right.
And I had nothing else to gauge it against those. So I thought it would be that way all the time. But yeah, learning to ride POW, I mean, it was glorious because every day was just refreshing, 6 inches, 8 inches, 4 inches, 10 inches. So you could kind of start to learn POW and in that way. And in fact, at one point, you're riding so much POW, you're like, I just want groomers because I want to go fast. Because there's only so fast you can go in like powder unless it's like an Alaska sized line or something like that.
Sure. How long does it take you to get used to all that, though? I mean, is it like after one season, are you used to gnarly terrain, or does it take a few seasons to get used to the steepness and the exposure that you get at Crested Butte?
I mean, it took probably a year or two. I mean, the constant evolution of big mountain riding takes time. It's like I remember going up on trips up to Whistler and riding like with Brian Savard or Sheen Campos and those guys and learning how to like look at a line from the bottom looking up. But then when you get to the top, you can't actually see your line. And so they taught me skills on how to figure out landmarks and different things like that to do your route finding. And so you could ride a line smoothly from top to bottom. So, I mean, it takes time. So yeah, I could do a lot of stuff within a year, but to ride it well takes a long time.
And the way that I think you were set up in life, especially at that point, it was like to ride everything. I mean, you have Hood, where you're in the park and it's jumps and it's just summertime riding. And then when you get to Crested Butte, it's just like the total opposite of that stuff. So you're riding everything, all different types of terrain. But what did you prefer?
I mean, I just loved everything. It's like, I just loved snowboarding, It's like early on, I was racing, I was, freestyle, big mountain stuff. I mean, and actually early on, there's shots of me in the, I think, Creatures of Habit 3 video hitting handrails in Gunnison and Crested Butte in that video back when I was on Kemper in those days. So I just loved snowboarding. It didn't really matter. I just wanted to be sliding down the mountain sideways.
And it's crazy because, yeah, like those clips of you in handrails early, it was like in your K2 days, you didn't really see that much handrail stuff from you. And it came back again in the robot food days. So it seemed like it was being shown early in the stuff you were doing on Kemper. But in K2, it seemed like there was a backcountry focus that didn't show as much of that. And maybe that was just the TB stuff. But then when robot food came out, it was all the way back like, oh, ETree's got all this as well. So your riding skills on any type of terrain were always there. And where you're at, there's a lot of legendary people at that school, Western State. Who was your crew?
Oh, man. I mean, at that time, Nate Christensen, was there as well. And funny story with him. I mean, he ended up becoming an amazing photographer, but he was back in Michigan. He was super good. I mean, he still is a good snowboarder. But then he tore his meniscus and picked up a camera. He was always into, video and photography and stuff. And then I needed photos for Kemper at that time. And then, so he shot that. And then that kind of just started his photography career. And then there's a handful of other people doing, photo and video work. And on the ski side, I mean, Seth Morrison was there at the same time. I mean, and he went on to legendary things. And yeah, it's just kind of crazy. It's like, the amount of people that were there and what was going on at that time was really cool.
Did you know Seth and like the MSP dudes back then, or was there a ski snowboard rivalry, or did that not exist in Gunnison?
No, I mean, you'd see people at parties and whatnot. And, it was like Seth, I think, was living with my buddies at the time in Gunnison and, like his freshman year. And so you knew everyone and you knew everyone on the hill, but yet at the same time, it's like when you were shredding the mountain, snowboarders ride the hill differently than skiers do in a sense. And so, it's like the classic sort of, you might see someone in a lift line, you ride up in the chair with them, but then you take different lines down the mountain and meet up at a chair again at the bottom.
It's time for my first sponsor break, and the 10 Barrel Brewery has done so much for action sports since they started brewing the Northwest's best beer in 2006. But what they've just done is truly game-changing. They've introduced a new German-inspired Pilsner to their lineup. And while Profuse Juice used to be my favorite, I love this Pilsner and will be drinking a lot of it this summer. It's light, refreshing, crisp, clean, and it has an aftertaste that I can't quite put my finger on, but it reminds me of drinking beer in my 20s, and that's awesome. It's tasty, it's nostalgic, and it's what you should try next time you're at the store. You can find out more about 10 Barrel, their events, their athletes, and the all-new Pilsner over at 10barrel.com. My next sponsor is Alpine Vans. They are the brand that Cody Townsend trusted to build his vehicle for the 50 project. And Cody now has an edit out on that build, and it's 14 minutes of awesomeness, and it really shows you why going with Alpine Vans on your Sprinter buy and build will be the best choice you make for your adventures, period. Cody's build is so sick, and every detail was thought of. And why is that? That's because the guys at Alpine know the features you need to live comfortably without sacrificing anything, because they know adventure life firsthand. From living at the ski resort to bike trips to surf, Alpine has lived it and knows what it takes to make your vehicle a functional home. And even with this electronics shortage, where it's hard to get your hands on a Sprinter, Alpine has an inventory of 8 vehicles ready to turn into your dream adventure mobile. I encourage you to head over to alpinevans.com and check out their impressive quote builder, which asks you the right questions to make sure your build is both what you need and what you want. My final sponsor is Stanley. And if you aren't ready for your camping, hiking, and general outdoor adventure needs yet, it's time to get on it. And you and yours deserve the best stuff out there. And Stanley has been setting the industry standard of innovation and quality and getting you out there since 1913. By listening to the Powell Movement, you're going to get the best deal you'll find on all Stanley products anywhere. It's through this podcast. I'll get you 30% off everything Stanley. All you need to do is head on over to stanley1913.com, go shopping, and use the code drinkfast. That's all one word, all lowercase at checkout, and you'll get that deal. Spend over $100 and I'll throw in a limited edition Powell Movement beanie. So please support the folks at Stanley and make sure you're dialed in for the summer. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but I'll get ahead of myself. I don't mind doing that. But with sponsors, I've always thought of you as a K2 guy. I had a few Zeppelins back in the day, and you were a big part of that team in the marketing. But before there was K2 for you, there was a few different brands. You had Kemper. I think your first published photo was on Aggression, and that was in like 92 or 93. But what was the whole QI thing that K2 brought together? Because it was like a sub-brand of K2, and it was called QI, and it was short-lived, and you were the face of that brand, it seemed like. What the hell was it?
Yeah, so QI, that's how I got involved with K2. And Luke Edgar came to Mount Hood that summer looking for someone for that brand that K2 was going to do, QI. And luckily, that time I was leaving Kemper. Kemper was going into the waste bin. And then that was it. And then Luke was like, hey, we're putting together a new brand. It's going to be premium products. It's going to be for core specialty retailers. And, we want you to be on this. And are you interested? And then at that time, there was a handful of different companies that I was talking to, and ended up, one of them was over in Europe and whatnot. And I was just like, you know what? They make the boards here in the States. It's just closer relationship, all that sort of stuff. Went with K2. And the whole QI thing was kind of interesting. When it got close to launching, it was supposed to be IQ. And I didn't even know what the name was going to be. They're just like, hey, this is the concept. This is what we're going to do. And then they were like, yeah, it's going to be IQ. And then all of a sudden, at the last second, they're like, oh, wait, there's another company that has a line of boards called IQ. So they just flipped it to QI. And I don't even know if they went to market. At that time, the snow show was down in Las Vegas, like in March. And I don't even know if they showed it at the show. Because I know, then that April, I went to Alaska riding those boards. I rode all winter on those boards. Yeah, and then in the spring, when I got back from Alaska and stuff, and I was up in Seattle at the factory, Luke was like, hey, we're going to discontinue that line. It never even went into retail. And then they just, moved me over to the K2 brand. And I'm kicking myself because I had the very first rideable QI snowboard. And I ended up years later cutting it up and making a motorcycle frame stand for it.
Oh, bummer. You mentioned you went to Alaska back then. This is like 1994. I would think Alaska is the Wild West. When you get there for the first time and you see those peaks, are you shitting your pants like, oh my God, I've got to snowboard those things?
Oh man. Yeah. I just stoked, fish out of water, just full rookie. But yeah, it was the Wild West. It was just like helicopters, you'd have chips, just drop us off on that peak. That looks great. And then, you either ride back down to the road to where a shuttle would pick you up, or a plane would drop you off up on top of a good flat glacier up high. And then you'd ride back. And yeah, it was the Wild West. And very funny story there. And I show up first day and I was rooming with Alain Bouchel and Billy Summers. And we were sharing a room in Valdez. And I'm just like a full rook. And, I'm like, hey, should I take my transceiver with us today? And then I think Alain was just like, dude, how could you ask a question like that? He's like, how the hell are you going to be able to find me if I'm in an avalanche? And I'm just like kicking myself. I'm like, oh, what a jackass. I can't believe I just asked that question,
Yeah.
And so then we went up and we rode that day and had a great day and stuff. And then we get back that evening. And then Alain's like, oh man, I totally forgot to put batteries in my transceiver today. I'm like, dude, you jerk. You made me feel like an ass. And yeah, you didn't even put batteries in your transceiver. But then again, it was like same thing, Wild West. It's like we weren't even checking to make sure we were even transmitting that our transceivers were on and different things like that. So it's a good thing that they now require guides up there.
Yeah, safety protocol has totally changed, I would think.
Yeah.
Back to QI, it's evident to the public that you aren't on that brand anymore because when TB5 comes out, you're on K2 product. And notably, the first shot of you was a clear shot of you riding K2's clicker product. And is this right at the launch of Step In?
Yeah. Early on, I just looked at that. It was cool. New product, had potential, started riding it. Actually, it was kind of funny because back to the story. In the spring, I was up at K2 and Luke was like, we're discontinuing the brand. And so obviously I got on the Fat Bobs, which was great because for me, the Fat Bob was a much better snowboard than the QI because it was wider.
Yep.
And it was perfect. And then the step-ins, I just started working with those guys, just right away on that stuff. Early on, it was interesting. Some of the boots were horrible.
Yeah, they had that really metally fit in the back of your calf area that didn't allow you to flex at all. It was really, really bad. It was like Shimano made boots and K2 made boots, and it depended on who you got the boot from if it was going to be a good one or a bad one.
Yeah, it was interesting. Some of the early days testing, we were over in Europe and Hintertux, and I just remember one pair of the boots, and one of the engineers was just like, oh my gosh, those boots are so bad. He's like, I dare you. I bet you can't even do a whole entire run on them. and I was like, no way, that's not possible. And sure enough, man, I was had tears coming out of my eyes halfway down the run. It was like I wanted to take the boots off and just walk down in my socks, but I made it.
Was that part of the deal with K2? It was like, hey, you're going to be on our program. We're going to transition you over from QI. We're going to put you in TB and make sure that you're part of those movies and have tons of exposure. We're going to have you traveling the world, but you are going to be riding our clicker binding. Was that part of your deal?
You know, there was never anything explicit that I had to ride clickers in there.
Okay.
That was all the choice and kind of helping evolve the product and make it better. But that was huge. I mean, being able to be in the standard films because of K2 was huge, you know. I mean, getting to work with Mike and his brother and those guys, it was crucial and clutch. I mean, granted, I could have totally choked
right,
and not performed while filming with those guys. You know, it was like, I think my first trip filming with them was we did a camping trip in Sonora in the spring in like late May. And then we show up and Mike and I had been shooting some stuff and got a couple things in the bag. And I remember we made a jump and Jim Rippey shows, you know, he calls Jim to come down and Jim Rippey shows up. And I think his first trick off a jump was like a backside 720. I was like, oh my gosh, that guy's pro. You know, I was just like in awe, but it was like, the good thing was like that trip, I got a couple really good bangers with those guys. And that kind of solidified a space on the crew.
And video parts back then were a little bit different. I mean, like you look at like TB6, when you look at the parts back then, I mean, the tricks are going to be different, obviously, because of progression, but it seemed like back then, it didn't matter if there was a hand drag or a hip check or anything like that. As long as you weren't on the ground, you were able to ride out. That's all that mattered back then, where today it has to be like totally clean, it seems like.
Well, I'd like to beg to differ on that one because, you know, like Mike's, I mean, it's like their name was Standard Films, but they set the bar quite high in a sense. And I mean, it was always tough because those guys, they didn't want the hand drags. They didn't want a butt drag. They didn't want, you know, a lot of times they didn't want another track. So you had to nail it first try, you know, like if you were dropping a cliff or something like that. So pressure was on. But I do remember back in the day, just always asking like, ski friends was like, dude, when are you guys going to start actually sticking landings? And one of my friends was just like, this was actually a Jamie Pierre. And he was like, oh, in skiing, he's like, as long as you don't lose your equipment, it's considered a stick. And I'm just like, oh man, that's weak.
Yeah. And I would say Jamie Pierre was on a different plane than most other people. I mean, the airs that he took were a lot bigger than anybody else. I don't think it was humanly possible to really land what he did, but I totally agree with you. Ski equipment back then was so narrow that there was no way to actually land something like you could on a snowboard because you just didn't have the platform. You would sink.
Right. Yep.
Back to K2.
Yep.
You were known for negotiating all your own deals, and it was like the gravy days of snowboarding, I feel like. Like there was a ton of pro snowboarders back then because there was a ton of brands, but you were one of the bigger names. You had a big brand behind you. Were you able to make some good loot with K2?
I mean, I'm not retired right now, so.
But I mean, could you make like 50 grand a year from a hard goods sponsor to be a pro snowboarder back then?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So if you could do that with K2, what other brands sponsored you back then?
The main sponsors you mentioned right off the bat, Dragon, you know, K2, those were my two longest sponsors. And then, of course, K2 was doing outerwear for a while, but before that was NFA clothing. And I learned really early on with contract negotiations, had a really hard lesson with them where I lost out on like 40 G's.
Damn.
You know, they just basically stopped paying Brian Savard and myself, and they still owed me that much money. But unfortunately, due to the contract and the way it was set up, well, I learned a lesson the hard way on that one.
Right.
And, you know, kind of set me up for stuff moving forwards. And then early on in the day, there weren't agents, you know, like there are now. It was only kind of later on, you know, when Steve Astafin and started representing his riders from Lamar and other people, and then grew his whole side of the management business, you know, and back then it was just endemic brands. So, you know, it was like for myself, you know, then Boots was like Northwave, and then 686. And, you know, those were the kind of the main things. And then eventually I left K2, which was kind of sad, but left to start Elevation Snowboards with Burt Lamar.
Yeah. So with K2 too, I mean, I'm going to talk about money for a little bit. They had a deal with VW at one point. I think you did an ad for them. Do you get any kickbacks, or is that just more exposure for you?
I actually didn't have any VW logos. A lot of the other guys did run VW logos, and I didn't show up in any of the VW commercial. Well, there wasn't any commercials. I know like Tim Manning and myself, we auditioned for it, but I don't know whatever happened with that. So no kickback on the VW thing. And then there was the Hanes Fruit of the Looms thing. I wasn't a part of that. it wasn't part of my contract. I told him, sure, if I want to, but I got to work something out with Haynes on that. It's just not gratuitous.
You got to get paid for that one. But with snowboarding and the dollars you're able to make, I mean, are there six-figure years, a bunch of years for you?
Oh, yeah.
So back then, when you were on top of the world in snowboarding, there was money to be made where things have changed a lot. I don't think everybody can make six figures, at least the people that I've talked to. You have to be in that top 5%, it feels like, to even be above there. But you have the brands paying you, and you've always been known as maybe one of the most entrepreneurial-minded snowboarders out there. Did you do anything to set yourself up for the future with the money that you were making? Did you make a bunch of investments?
Yeah, I mean, I bought rental properties and such, and was always smart like that because I always knew the gravy train would run out at one point or another. One of my properties I still have was great because I was renting it out to Blotto, who was Burton's photographer. So it was great. I was getting checks from K2 and Burton at the same time.
That's awesome. And to do all this with snowboarding exploding for you, I'm guessing that you drop out of school or you take some breaks from school. And how do your parents react to that? I mean, that's just an assumption. I don't really know what happens.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. It was like my sophomore year in college my career was starting to take off and was traveling a ton. It's like I'd be gone for 2 weeks, come back, take an exam, and then be gone again for another 2 weeks and like just traveling with my business law books or whatever, courses I was taking at that time. And I was just like, man, I'm going to have to make a decision here. It's either like do the winters for snowboarding or school. And I was just like, oh, I got to give snowboarding a shot. And so my thought was I'd always go to school during the fall and then snowboard in the winter. But yeah, that drastically changed. And, it's so fearful when I was like going to tell my parents, hey, I've made this decision. And the crazy thing though is my parents have just always been so supportive in everything I do, which helps a ton, and it's just like my stomach is just in knots. And before I tell them, I'm like going through my mind. I'm like, okay, how am I going to say this? What's the pros? What's the cons? What's,
Yeah.
all this sort of stuff. And then they're like, okay, well, if that's what you want to do and if that's what's going to make you happy, then we support it. And I'm just like, what? I'm like, okay, cool. Yeah. And then the rest was history. I mean, I did a fall term and then that was it. And then my career just completely took off and was summers and Southern Hemisphere and Europe in the fall and shop tours in the fall and all that sort of stuff.
And I've mentioned that you ride everything. You were one of the faces of K2's backcountry clicker thing and known to ride everything regular or switch. But people still remember and talk about your switch riding as a standout part of your game. Is that something that came natural to you, or is it something that you spent a shit ton of time on trying to figure out how to ride switch and POW and make that a focus of your game?
I mean, yeah, you only get good at it by doing it a lot. It's kind of funny. People always ask me kind of like, well, why do you ride switch so much? Or why do you do that? I always go back to one day I was walking home from school and I saw my older brother coming down the road, driving his car. And he was coming down the roads backwards, just driving just for a long time backwards. And he got up to me and I was just like, Rob, well, why are you driving down the road backwards? He's like, oh, I can drive forwards just fine. And so that's kind of my answer for why I rode switch so much.
Oh, it's pretty funny. And part of your game too is you're on the contest circuit. I mean, you ride that train for a while. How many events were you going to each year?
I mean, early on in the career, I was doing a ton. The contests were kind of the way to get your name out there. And then you can go and film. I mean, granted, at the same time, I was still filming. I mean, I was doing a ton. I was doing contests. I was filming. It was like nonstop. I was rarely home. Salt Lake was my home base, but it was always one place or another. But the funny thing is I kind of disliked contests and I wouldn't do as good as I probably could have because I didn't necessarily have a coach. Because I'd just sit there, you show up to a contest, you do your practice runs, everything's great because it's a super fun, slope style course or the pipe is great or whatever, and then you just sit there and you wait around for like an hour to take your run. And then you take your run and it's like, okay, now I make it to the finals and you wait like another hour. And then it's like, oh, okay, now you get to do a warm up run, some warm up runs before the finals. And then I would be just so excited that I would just be like running up and down the half pipe, just like using way too much energy and just getting all hot and sweaty and stuff. And then it's like, okay, now it's time for the finals. And then you're just sitting there at the top of a pipe or slopestyle or whatever. And then you're just like sweaty, and then you're just like cold and shivering, waiting for your next 2 final runs and such. And you would like freeze up. But yeah, I mean, contests were a big part of it. I loved it. And I just loved snowboarding.
And the biggest contest that you were a part of most likely is the X Games. That comes along in like 98 for you. I think the first one's at Crested Butte. But you end up medaling at the Summer X Games, I feel like, in 99 in San Francisco. So you have some hardware for the mantle. You get a bronze medal there. But overall, what's your best X Games memory?
One of my best ones is actually that first X Games and Crested Butte, and in the border cross in the final race or whatever. I messed up out of the gate and I was slow, but I was like passing people, and coming in towards the final, there's like a jump, and there's like Andy Hetzel, who was ahead of me, and coming up, and I'm like, on your left. And so he like moves over to his left. And of course I went on his right and passed him, and Hetz was pissed. So
that's awesome. And another thing about that time was the tricks being invented, and they were being invented and named left and right. It was an innovative time. And one of the more innovative tricks that unlocked a lot of things was the backside rodeo. And some people say you invented it. Some people say it was Peter Line. And most people say it was Kevin Sansalone. Who invented the trick?
It's interesting because Pat Moore did a great post on this earlier this year. And I like to say I came up with the form of it. Hadn't seen anyone, thought about it in my mind for like 2 years. And it's like such an unnatural kind of maneuver, looking over your back shoulder, your trailing shoulder, to do a spin that way. But then eventually learned it up on Teton Pass, and then did it up on a NFA photo shoot up in Whistler, which is kind of interesting. And then that summer was up filming with Stander, was up at Hood, and I was just like, you know, I need something for my part that people are going to rewind the videotape.
Yep.
And you know, I was like, dude, I'm going to try the backside rodeo. And I'd only ever done them as a 5 before, as a 540. But, you know, when I spun it, I went bigger than I thought and ended up doing it as a 720 and stuck it. And of course it made it in the film that year, and which was totally awesome. And then the following year I saw Pete over at High Cascade hitting jumps, and he was doing kind of like a backside rodeo, but of course his had like way better style than mine. I mean, he's just has amazing style, and his was kind of more of a flat spin, if you will.
Okay.
You know, and then he coined the term backside rodeo. Then of course that ended up in Mac Dog's film the following year. So I think Pete likes to think he invented it, you know, because he made it popular, but the root of it is there. And Sansalone, you know, maybe he was doing them as well. He could have been, but I don't remember seeing them from him at that time. So
we're going to give it to you.
Can't speak to that. Yeah. All right.
It's time for another sponsor break. And now that ski and snowboard season is over, Peter Glenn doesn't stop. They're the one-stop shop for all of your summer needs. You want a pair of inline skates, a wakeboard? Peter Glenn has it, and has had it for over 70 years. They are a mom-and-pop group of shops that do a great job competing with the cutthroat online guys, but still offer a low price guarantee, free shipping on orders of over $50, and a no-hassle return policy. They support a lot of great things in action sports, this podcast, Johnny Mosley, and so much more. So when you go shopping, please check out peterglenn.com to get some of the best prices and the greatest variety of products on the internet. My final sponsor is Rollerblade, and it's summertime. There's no better time to get out there and go skate than right now. Whether you find yourself using skating for fitness, skating the streets or skate parks, or heading out for marathon skate sessions, Rollerblade has the best skates on the market. I mean, these guys invented inline skating. And when they can't skate, they ski. And if you're a skier, Rollerblade also has a skate-to-ski program that they built out to get you in shape for ski season. It's the best crossover tool ever invented, and it will get your legs in much better shape than biking or running could ever do. To find out about the app, head on over to the App Store to download it, and to see the latest and greatest from Rollerblade, head on over to rollerblade.com. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. You had mentioned that it was sad when you left K2, but it's a time when snowboarding's kind of exploding with brands and there's so much excitement going on. Bert Lamar is, I mean, I don't know if he comes to you and says, hey, I want to start a brand. I want you to start it with me, but it's time for you to start your own brand with Bert. And how do you go to K2 and be like, hey, thanks for the opportunity. Now I'm going to go kick your ass with my own brand?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. The whole relationship with Bert, we started talking. He had sold Lamar Snowboards and had a non-compete. And so during that time, he was doing finger snowboard licensing. So then I, started working with him, on that and had a signature finger snowboard and, and stuff like that. And we would just talk and whatnot. And then he was like, hey, my non-compete's up. What's going on with you and K2? And I was like, well, my contract's coming up with K2. And so then I was going into negotiation and, it was like K2, there was someone else. And then there was the offer with Bert. I'd been with K2 for a long time, and it was kind of funny because K2 didn't really think I was going to leave. I think like Brian Craighill was the team manager at the time. And, and I was telling him, I'm like, dude, Brian, like, this is for real. I was like, these are real offers that I'm getting, and it was like Brent Turner was the head at the time, the GM. And he was like, no, like Brent doesn't want to talk to you. And I'm like, well, these offers are legit. I'm like, I'd rather not leave K2 and whatnot. I mean, that's kind of how it played out. And then eventually it was just a sad conversation. I was just like, look, I've got to go. You guys aren't willing to talk and come to the table. And at the same time, quite honestly, I was like interested. I'd been snowboarding for a long time. And so starting a company with Bert and we started Elevation, it allowed me to grow as a person. And work on the marketing and the team and all that stuff and product design and, take all the stuff I had been doing at K2, a lot of it and more, and learn even more on the business side.
It's like snowboard college for you?
Yeah, I mean, that was appealing to me as well. So ultimately, I probably should have taken less money and stayed with K2. But you never know.
But you didn't know how the landscape of the industry was going to play out because eventually the bottom drops out. The sport kind of starts declining and a lot of the brands start disappearing. And then it works into like a recession, it seems like. And you're timed into like the worst part of that. Is that kind of what kills that brand?
Well, the big thing is, we went to market. We overproduced our first year. And then when our go-to-market was basically 9/11, with the World Trade Tower attack. And that just like all of a sudden right off the bat, retailers were a little hesitant then of like what's going on. So then we sat on inventory that year. And then of course we were working with the Taylor Dykema factory down in San Diego. And then of course one of the co-founders of Taylor Dykema decided he was done partying in Cabo and wanted to be a part of the business. And then basically once he came back, Taylor Dykema internally imploded and went out of business. And so then we were scrambling to like find new factories and different things like that. It was like rough hit after rough hit of, like 9/11 and then factory and then trying to scramble to find another factory. And then that factory like didn't deliver on time. It was just kind of the snowball of where people only give you so many tries and eventually it's just tough. And that's where then I eventually parted ways with Elevation. And Bert tried to make it go on for like another year and, but ended up folding it.
Yeah. And during that time, you have another venture that keeps you totally relevant within the snowboard world. It's Robot Food. And while I don't know if the whole thing was your idea, it sounds like you were a key player in keeping the funding going with that. And what did that whole movie production company look like behind the scenes? I mean, were you part of the actual business there?
Yeah, I mean, it was a tight crew. I mean, it was David Benedict, it was Pierre Vickberg, it was, Jess Gibson and Travis and UC. I mean, realistically, Travis and UC put up the funds initially to get the editing equipment and to get the editing bay going for Pierre and Jess. But it was like all of us. So like we had a good crew, Bobby Meeks and, and Yoni Amalmi and just, like we kind of had our crew that we were all filming with Standard, but we were kind of like our own crew, and then Jess had met Pierre on a shoot and, all had like minds and stuff like that. And so then we just kind of came together. I was like, hey, let's do this. We know how to do all this stuff. And, it's like David Benedict had a ton of creative visions. And of course he went on to do some really rad stuff after Robot Food. But the whole time it was kind of like Robot Food could implode at any time because here you have like all these like highly creative people.
Yep.
And I was like, it could just implode, but it didn't. We put out 3 great films and it was just awesome. I mean, just the creativity of everyone involved. And I mean, I think maybe you give me more credit than I deserve. I just tried to help out where I could with it. and different things like that. But it was, there was that core crew and we still talk. It's kind of funny. We're always like, dude, we need to do a reunion. And then you have like Vilay's like, oh, I can't go at that time because it's like coffee bean harvesting time, and then someone else is like, oh, I can't do that. I can't go then because of this or whatnot, But one of these days we'll have another robot food reunion, and I don't know, we'll call it After Pro or something.
And if you think about it, like with the market back then, it was all DVDs, I would think, in that era. And it was before downloads killed the video star or the DVD star. But how many DVDs are you guys actually moving with each movie?
Well, the funny thing is we were right at that like phase from VHS to DVD. So the crazy thing very early on, for Afterbang was like, how many of these do we produce in VHS and how many do we produce in DVD? which is kind of crazy conundrum. But, we were doing right on par to what a Standard or a Mac Dog was doing, like at that time. But we knew also that the landscape was changing. You had like Napster and illegal music downloading and all that stuff at that point in time. And, we knew it was going to be changing.
Speaking of changing in terms of your career, you put out those films, but then Elevation kind of goes under. You still have Dragon supporting you a little bit, but I'm sure the sponsors kind of dwindle away at that point. When you lose your final sponsor or the people start walking away and you realize that your pro riding career may be over, is that like total punch in the gut to you, like a hit to the ego, or is it something where you're able to appreciate the amazing career you had?
No, I mean, I totally appreciated everything that I ever got from snowboarding and what I had and absolutely loved it. And, the kind of the interesting thing is I went from 200 days a year snowboarding to 2 the next year. And I didn't think I would go from 200 days to 2, but back then my wife was down in Carlsbad and I had my house in Salt Lake and, we'd be back and forth and I'd be during the winter traveling all over and whatnot. But then once that started, I created a business down in Carlsbad and it was just like head on into that business.
You were selling print cartridges and they're a total hassle to buy. So it sounds like you probably went into the business knowing that it was a hassle. You were going to make it easy for people. Were you able to kill it in the print cartridge market?
We did well. Actually the store is still there. Ended up selling it to my manager, but the print cartridge market's tough because it just got flooded by overseas knockoffs and different things like that. And it was hard to have quality control, which was difficult and tough, but did that for, I think, like a year and a half. And then Snowboarder Mag hit me up to run that. And it was just kind of like, okay, let's see. Am I as passionate about printer cartridges as I am about snowboarding? Let's do that.
Yeah. And I would think when you're named the general manager of Snowboarder Magazine, I would think in some ways that's even better than being a pro. Like you have a salary, you have benefits. I would think it's probably a 6-figure job with budgets to burn and travel and exciting stuff. Did it have everything that a pro had, but not the actual requirement of being able to perform?
No, being an athlete's way, way better. I had way fewer sleepless nights as a pro snowboarder. In fact, I probably had 0 sleepless nights as a pro snowboarder. So running the magazine and media business, way more pressures on you and definitely not as awesome. And not as free, you just don't have that free time that you have as an athlete to when, if you want to go do something, you can go do it. But when you're running a business and a media, you've got lots of people to work with and make sure stuff's getting done.
Yeah. And with the magazines, you're part of a larger company. And eventually I think you're named to a title where you're running all the publications within the company. Is that correct? Yeah,
eventually I was overseeing our whole entire sports portfolio, which, included powder and bike and surfer and Transworld Moto and all that stuff. And so, I was in charge of sales for all that stuff. So I was working with the sales teams and all that sort of stuff.
Were you there when Transworld was picked up by that group?
I was, yeah.
How weird is that? How does that even happen?
Yeah, that whole play was really kind of crazy. My colleague, she was on a business trip with, we're a part of all the media, whether it was Transworld or us, are all part of a bigger media conglomerate. And our company at that time, I think we were rebranded as Enthusiast Media. And we have offices all over the US. And she was at like some meeting over there with some other office. And she comes back and she's like, She's like, oh my gosh. She's like, I think we might be buying Transworld. And she's like, how amazing would that be? And I was just kind of like, I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
I'm like, that's going to be really hard to do. And it was kind of funny because she wasn't from the industry. She was like from the outside. And in a sense, I was just like, I don't know. It could be tough. And sure enough, I mean, how it all played out was our company, Enthusiast Media, was selling our motorcycle division to Bonnier. And then Bonnier at the same time was like, hey, do you want to buy our action sports division? During that whole deal. And I don't know what money was put down on it, but supposedly from our perspective, it was a good deal to pick up Transworld. But it was like, anytime you're in a merger and acquisition, I mean, it's like you're trying to merge two cultures that were like competitors. It's like, man, that is such a hard thing to do.
And from the big picture standpoint, I mean, from your position, do you happen to see the writing on the wall? Like, the print world's facing a slow death, and buying another magazine that competes with one of your magazines isn't really the best business practice, I would think.
No, definitely not. And it's kind of funny because it was like, the higher ups, were just like, oh, this will be great. We'll own the entire market, But then all of a sudden it's just like advertisers are just like, well, why do we need to be advertising in both?
Right.
And at the same time, say like Transworld Surf, was like the number 3 title in the space. But then as soon as, the merger occurred, it was like, well, that shut down. And dude, that money just dried up, that revenue. And the higher ups for us thought that money would just magically, that not 100% of it would stick around. They anticipated there would be some attrition, but the attrition was way more than they anticipated,
Yeah. And another thing I really never understood with that stable of brands is, why did they all suck so bad at digital? Like, they could have taken the reins and owned every industry they were in. They eventually bought New Schoolers, or New Schoolers became a part of that.
Yeah.
New Schoolers was an example of how to run digital and own your sport until that company bought it, and they fucked New Schoolers up too.
Yeah, it's crazy. Love Doug Bishop. He's awesome. And that's the hardest thing. It's like, because the business model for that whole company was built on, the old school print magazine world.
Yep.
And that was in my career when I was working with all the different titles, it was like some groups got it, the digital side of it, and others didn't. And then even when I say got it, like the level of what they got wasn't nearly as high as what it should be. But it was just people, it was hard. I mean, it was like moving a freaking container ship, 180 degrees is like, takes freaking forever. And some of the editorial teams just couldn't wrap their head around digital.
No, I experienced that firsthand. I totally know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Eventually your time at 10 ends, and I don't know if it's your choice or part of their many layoffs that they had, but there was a whole bunch of things going on. We don't even need to talk about how it ends, but it ended. And then you start working with TGR. You do a year at TGR. I don't know why your time ends there, but TGR, before you got there, was firing, and they were firing after you left. So it was like, I don't even know if they needed you there at that point.
Yeah, no, it worked out great. It was a good transition. My wife took a job back in Park City. And so then it was kind of like I was commuting back and forth between Park City and Carlsbad. And then the opportunity came up with TGR. So then I was commuting between Park City and TGR. And that was a great year and loved it. Steve and Todd. The funny thing is, back in the early days, we talked about the early days of Alaska. When we were filming with Standard, Steve and Todd would be our actual guides because we were flying with like Doug Coombs' operation at the time, and they were guides for Doug's outfit. So I met those guys very early on in my career and whatnot. So they're doing a lot of great things over there, lots of good films and stuff like that. But, all media companies kind of are challenged because there's, it's like a changing landscape.
Well, I would say the thing that they did, that New Schoolers was doing until they're not doing it anymore, was they were all about building community. And the thing with TGR is they have, I think they call them the maggots or the people on their message boards. And those dudes bleed for that brand. And TGR can make goggles and make 8 million Grateful Dead products because those people are going to buy them because they've been TGR fans and part of that community forever. It's kind of like their Pearl Jam's mailing list people who are like just dedicated. And TGR's done a great job of that. And there's something to be said for building community. And you finished with TGR, and it's like, I mean, sure, you're contracted and doing stuff here and there in the industry, but like, you don't have a big industry job at this point. Is that a bummer, or were you ready to get away, or do you see yourself coming back, or where are things right now with ETree?
I mean, right now I'm in between. After I left TGR, I was on an awesome radical sabbatical, had a great winter, got a ton of great snowboarding and Baja surf trips in. And then I started with the Outbound Collective, and that's a, app website based out of San Francisco, worked remote for those guys. We were doing some really cool stuff with them, events where we would get people out in the summertime, camping, hiking, rock climbing, kayaking, and they were basically 3-day weekend events. Those things were totally awesome. Couldn't really make any money at them because they were so expensive to put on. But then, last spring, things changed. COVID hits. Had a bunch of big deals with like Visit Florida and, other state tourism boards and stuff like that. And all that stuff got put on hold or canceled, because of travel and the COVID. And then I pivoted and helped a buddy start a disinfection sprayer company for the past year and then worked nonstop for a year on that.
Well, there's a need for that. And at this point, we're not going to talk about disinfecting sprayers. But what we are going to do is we're going to do something I call inappropriate questions. And what I do is I usually get someone who knows you, and I get them to ask 3 inappropriate questions. And I did know people who knew you, and I was trying to get them to ask inappropriate questions, but nobody had anything inappropriate to say about you. So then they said, hey, you should talk to Corey Smith. Because while I don't know Corey, they said, you know Corey well, and if you talk to him, you're going to get your inappropriate questions. So what do? I reach out to Spring Break's Corey Smith, and I'm like, hey, dude, I've always wanted to get you on my podcast, so we should talk about scheduling an interview. But right now, I want to talk to you about asking 3 inappropriate questions for Chris Engelsman. And he's like, dude, I don't know Chris Engelsman. I'm like, what do you mean you don't know Chris Engelsman? People told me that you did. He said, I don't, and it happened to be a different Corey Smith that you know. So I ended up coming up with no inappropriate questions from a guest, and I came up with them myself. So I am going to ask you 3 inappropriate questions. I'm going to give you my first one right now. And having good style is a hard thing to do as a tall dude. You do it better than most. And when you were a pro, there were a shit ton of pros. Not all of them were worthy, but they were there. Can you name the tallest pro-level snowboarder with the worst style that you saw in your opinion?
Oh, man.
I know. I'm totally asking you to throw somebody under the bus.
I mean, other ones. I'll only do this one because he threw me under the bus early on, and we had a little head-to-head action. I'll just say Abe Teeter.
Huh. How'd he throw you under the bus?
Good old Mark Sullivan and Rob Campbell coaxed him into asking him who he thought was the most underrated snowboarder. And then he listed my name. He said my name. And of course they published it. And they were just totally trying to strum up controversy and that sort of stuff. And it worked, I hit those guys up and I was like, dude, what's up with this? And Abe, what's up? And so then we did a head-to-head battle up at Mount Hood. And I proceeded to, then a shot, I think it might have ended up, because Kurt Heine was filming it, and I ended up puncturing my bicep on a handrail.
Oh, man.
Trying to do a gap-to-gap rail transfer over a spinning rake, and slipped off the first rail and then proceeded to body pile into the downhill rail.
Like impaled yourself?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was crazy. I had a tube sticking out of my arm for a while. Yeah. Anyway, style is really tough for tall dudes. It's harder. We got to really work on it.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you answered that one, and it came out better than I thought that would. My second inappropriate question is, you've been known to be a prankster, I hear, in your past, and at summer camp, I think there were a lot of pranks pulled between the diggers and the coaches. And what was the best prank you pulled on the coaches when you were a digger?
Oh, man. I think one of the best ones was when we were living in the Ark, and we went and we put notes on all the doors and it was across all the doors. Didn't matter who or what part of the staff you were working on, but we were like, the water has been contaminated. Please do not shower or use. Oh, people were pissed, because it's like, dude, you're hot, you're sweaty, you're salty, you're dirty, you're dusty, like all this stuff. And it was just like, oh my gosh, that just infuriated so many people. And then it was just funny. And, just to let them know, it's like, dude, it's just a joke.
That's an amazing one. I wish I was young again. I would pull that one somewhere. All right, my final inappropriate question is, I hear there's always kind of a bottom line with you. Like I said, entrepreneurial spirit. It was like you're always thinking of getting rich quick, and there was a bottom line to you. So when you would rent your Salt Lake City places out to riders, I heard that Peter Line rented from you at one point. I don't know if that's true or not. But is it true that you rented him a comforter or bedding or something like that and actually charged him for it?
No, I don't think Pete's. A lot of people stayed at my house in Salt Lake, but I don't think Pete was ever one of them. We had a rule: if you stayed at the house for like more than a month, you had to start paying rent. And that all fell back to our days when we had 8 of us living in a 2-bedroom condo in Snowmass, because we had a couple people that ended up basically were living with us full time, but weren't paying anything. And we were like, okay, you guys got to start chipping in on the payment. So we basically all started that rule of if you stayed more than a month, you had to start paying rent.
Well, that makes sense. And I think everybody should at that age, because I'm sure you're past 18, you should pay rent if you're staying somewhere longer than a month. But that's the inappropriate questions and the podcast at this point. I mean, I want to thank you for your time. And in thinking back, I mean, when I was really into snowboarding and like thought that was my whole life, you were like a king at K2, and K2 was my favorite brand at that point, given a lot of things have changed over the years. But I look at you and Brian Savard and some of the other people as having a huge impact on my life. And I want to thank you for that, man. And thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And great work on the research.
That was time with Chris Engelsman, and what a nice guy. It sounds like if Chris could have done it all over, he would have skipped the elevation part and stayed with the big brand K2. But really, if he doesn't go to elevation, he really doesn't get to know how the industry works behind the scenes. Because regardless of what he was doing as a pro athlete, negotiating his contracts and doing all that, you really don't know what's going on behind the scenes unless you were seeing the budgets, planning them, and seeing what's actually driving the sales. It's a totally different game. Regardless, Chris has had a pretty awesome career in snow, and I'm going to guess he's not completely done. But as always, what do I know? Anyways, that's the podcast, and now it's time for me to read the review of the week. And this week, it's a 5-star review, and it comes from Clint S.E. It's titled Fantastic, and this one is short but sweet. Mike is the man, flat out. Great podcast, and great to see his sponsors coming back. Well, it is debatable whether I'm the man flat out, but it is great to see my sponsors coming back. And while it was a challenge when COVID started and half of them dropped off and I didn't know what the hell was going to happen, that was only a worry for a couple of weeks. And then I had a bunch of great brands come and save the day. And I'm stoked to have all these guys supporting me 100%. And things look bright for the future as podcasting is one of those mediums I feel like that's growing and is really providing a return for the advertisers. But whatever, you're a listener, you don't need to hear about the return for the advertisers. So Clint S.E., thank you so much for that review. Please email me at mike@thepowellmovement.com and I will send you a beanie. Everybody else knows they can do the same thing. If I read their review on the podcast, they'll get a beanie as well. That's the show for this week. At this point, I want to thank you all for listening, and I want to ask you guys to support my amazing sponsors because they really do make this thing happen. They are the 10 Barrel Brewery, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports Rollerblade, Stanley, and Alpine Vans. Have a great week, everyone.